Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story of a horrific lineage, the Moorfield family, and a curse of madness passed down through generations that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The autumn of 1883 in Massachusetts brought with it a biting chill, a damp, pervasive cold that seemed to penetrate not just cloth and skin, but to the very marrow of the bone. It was a cold that whispered of coming hardship, of long nights and secrets best left buried. Dried leaves, brittle and brown, crackled beneath the wheels of the lone carriage transporting Jonathan Morfield. The carriage moved like a hearse along the winding road, a dark vein snaking through the dense, skeletal forests. Above, the sky was a heavy, seamless shroud of grey, a perfect mirror for the despair that had settled in his soul. Jonathan adjusted the worn collar of his coat, a garment that was once of impeccable quality, but now working like its owner, showed the unmistakable signs of disgrace. At 35, his face was already etched with the deep lines of a much older man, silent witnesses to the scandalous months that had shattered his life in Boston. His name, once respected in the city's legal circles, was now a synonym for ruin. The accusations of fraud, the fury of his clients, and the final, crushing weight of bankruptcy, the echoes of it all were a constant, tormenting chorus in his mind. He had lost everything. And then it appeared on the horizon, Moorfield Mansion. It did not simply stand upon the hill, it seemed to hunch, brooding, a jagged silhouette against the oppressive sky. Built in 1790 by his great-great-grandfather, Elijah Moorfield, the imposing Victorian structure seemed to claw at the clouds with its pointed towers and severe angular roof. Its many windows, some shattered like broken teeth, others boarded up, looked like vacant eyes, observing his fated return with a profound and ancient indifference. "We've arrived, sir," announced the coachman, an elderly man whose somber, weathered face seemed carved from old wood. "Moorfield Mansion." "Thank you," Jonathan replied, his voice hoarse. He descended from the carriage with his single, battered suitcase, though the weight of his new reality was far heavier. "How much do I owe you?" The old coachman simply shook his head, his gaze flickering nervously toward the looming house. "Nothing, sir. I've already been paid to bring you here." A strange chill, colder than the autumn air, traced its way down Jonathan's spine. Paid by whom? "By Mr. Thaddeus Green, the lawyer. He said the key would be under the vase at the entrance." The man hesitated, his hands tightening on the reins, his reluctance to linger palpable. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If I may, sir, the people in town, they talk about this place. They say no good comes from stirring what lies sleeping here." Jonathan forced a smile that felt brittle on his face. "Local superstitions, I imagine." "Perhaps, sir." The coachman conceded, his eyes wide with a certainty that defied reason. But mark my words, no one from the Moorfield family has had a peaceful end in generations. Without another word, he pulled sharply on the reins. May God protect you, sir. The carriage departed with a speed that felt like a desperate flight, leaving Jonathan utterly alone before the property that was his last resort, his only hope, and, perhaps, his tomb. The rusty iron gate emitted a sharp, metallic moan as he pushed it open, a sound like a creature in prolonged agony. The path to the main entrance was choked with weeds and loose stones, nature's quiet, persistent attempt to reclaim the cursed ground. Jonathan observed the facade, noting the gothic details. The gargoyles, worn by a century of harsh New England weather, seemed to leer down at him, their stone faces twisted into silent, eternal warnings. He did not know, not yet, that the very ground beneath his feet was contested soil, a place the local Wampanoag tribe had long ago called the land of hungry spirits, and had pleaded with his ancestor not to defile with the foundation. As promised, a heavy bronze key was hidden under a pot of dead, skeletal plants. For a moment, he hesitated, its cold weight in his hand feeling less like a key and more like a shackle, binding him to this place. The air itself felt thick, pushing back with a static pressure, as if the house itself did not want to be disturbed. Nonsense, he muttered, the words sounding hollow and unconvincing in the profound silence. He inserted the key into the lock. The door opened with a prolonged, deep creak, revealing a vast, dark entrance hall. The smell that rushed out to greet him was a sickening trinity: the damp breath of mold, the dry dust of forgotten decades, and something else, something indefinable and organic, like disturbed earth and the faint, sweet odor of decay. Jonathan placed his suitcase on the cracked marble floor and closed the heavy door behind him. The sound echoed with a grim finality, sealing his fate. The dim light that penetrated the filthy windows revealed furniture shrouded in white sheets, standing like a silent congregation of ghosts. From the walls, the darkened portraits of his ancestors watched him. Their severe faces, rendered in faded oils, seemed to possess a flat, painted malevolence. Their eyes, a legacy of the Morfield bloodline, followed his every move. Lighting a dusty lamp he found on a side table, Jonathan began to explore the ground floor. The living room, dining room, library, each was a cold, preserved mausoleum of abandonment. A sudden, violent crash from upstairs shattered the silence, making him start. The lamp wavered in his hand, casting dancing, monstrous shadows that writhed upon the walls. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive emptiness of the vast mansion. Only the mournful groan of old wood answered, with his heart hammering against his ribs. Jonathan slowly climbed the main staircase, each step protesting under his weight with a weary sigh. In the second-floor corridor, closed doors lined both sides like sealed crypts. The first door on the right was unlocked. He pushed it open, revealing what must have been the master bedroom, a grand canopy bed. Its frame, carved with grim-faced cherubs, dominated the space. But it was a desk near the window that drew his attention. Upon it lay a pile of old leather-bound books, their covers warped by damp and time. They were diaries. Approaching, he saw the oldest was dated 1795, its leather cracked like dry skin. written in the elegant, spidery script of Elijah Moorfield. Flipping through the yellowed, brittle pages, his eyes caught on a series of disturbing phrases that made the hair on his arms stand on end. "The nightmares continue," Elijah wrote. "I see faces in the shadows, hear voices in the wind. Elizabeth says I'm going mad, but I know what I saw in the basement." Jonathan snapped the diary shut, a profound chill flooding his veins. Next to the stack, he found a sealed envelope. His own name, Jonathan Morfield, written upon it in a lawyer's precise hand. He broke the seal and extracted the letter. "Dear Mr. Morfield," it began. "As the legal administrator of your family's property, it is my duty to inform you about certain aspects of your inheritance. The Moorfield mansion has a complex and troubling history. I strongly recommend that you examine your ancestors' diaries. There are medical records in the office on the first floor that also deserve your immediate attention. Until we may speak in person, I suggest extreme caution, especially after dark." He reread the letter, a growing sense of dread coiling in his stomach like a cold serpent. What was so terrible that it required such a cryptic, urgent warning? As if in answer, a sudden, unnatural wind swept through the sealed room. The lamp flame flickered wildly, and the tattered curtains rippled as if touched by an invisible hand. For a single, heart-stopping instant, Jonathan saw it, or thought he saw it, a pale, gaunt silhouette in the window, observing him from the blackness outside. He lunged towards it, but there was nothing but the night, now falling like a final, heavy curtain over the Moorfield property. That night, lying fully clothed atop the dusty bedspread, Jonathan could not find the solace of sleep. He listened to the grim symphony of the old house, the low whistle of the wind through unseen cracks, the arthritic creaking of ancient wood, and, occasionally, what sounded disturbingly like the soft, dragging footsteps of someone pacing in the corridor just outside his door. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying for the dawn. And it was then, in that hazy, terrifying borderland between wakefulness and slumber, that the silence was finally broken. It was not a creak, nor the wind, but a sibilant whisper that seemed to bloom from the very darkness of the room. A voice that knew him, that had been waiting for him, and that now spoke his name into the void as if tasting it. "Jonathan." Morning arrived with a pale, grudging light that seemed hesitant to trespass into the oppressive gloom of the Moorfield mansion. Jonathan awoke with a violent start, the disembodied whisper of his own name still echoing in the hollows of his memory. A venomous residue from a night devoid of rest. He lay paralyzed on the ancient bedspread, the cold, stale air a shroud upon his skin. The events of the previous night assaulted his senses, the brittle pages of the diaries, the fleeting, ghostly figure in the window, the final, intimate whisper that had violated the sanctity of his own mind. It all felt both distant and intensely real, like the feverish fragments of a nightmare from which he had not truly awoke. Sleep had offered no sanctuary, only a continuation of the house's suffocating embrace. After a frugal, tasteless meal of cheese and stale bread, a gnawing, desperate urgency began to eclipse his fear. He could not flee. He had nowhere left to run. The lawyer's letter, with its cryptic mention of medical records, became his sole focus. A fragile lifeline in a sea of encroaching madness. He needed answers. He needed the cold, hard validation of science and reason to build a wall against the terrors of the night. He needed proof that he was not, in fact, descending into the same abyss that had methodically claimed his forefathers. He found the office on the first floor, just as the letter had implied. A somber room that felt like the very heart of the mansion's melancholy. It was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves laden with crumbling legal texts and forgotten literature, their spines faded and cracked. A heavy oak desk, its surface scarred with the ghosts of past signatures, stood like a judge's bench in the center of the room. In one of its deep drawers, his fingers, trembling slightly, brushed against a worn leather folder. Inside, a collection of documents, their paper yellowed and fragile as autumn leaves, were bound by a faded ribbon. These were the medical records, the clinical testaments to the ruin of the Moorfield men. The oldest, dated 1802, concerned his great-great-grandfather, Elijah. The report, penned by a Dr. Samuel Winthrop, a Boston physician of some repute in the nascent field of diseases of the mind, was written in a script that was both elegant and chillingly detached. Jonathan forced himself to read, his mind absorbing every word. The patient, Mr. Elijah Morfield, presents with a constellation of symptoms indicative of advanced paranoia and persecutory delusions. He holds the unshakable conviction that he is being observed by unseen entities, which he claims inhabit the very walls and foundations of his property. He describes these entities with a peculiar and inconsistent mixture of fear and reverence. He reports severe auditory and visual hallucinations, particularly exacerbated during the nighttime hours, which he documents with a near-scientific obsession in his private journals. Most concerning to this practitioner is his monomaniacal fixation with the mansion's basement. He refers to this subterranean space not as a cellar, but as a place of communion, where he claims to have discovered the tangible source of the family curse, an artifact he believes predates human history. This fixation has, on one occasion, resulted in a violent episode wherein he physically assaulted his wife, Mrs. Morfield, accusing her of conspiring with these phantoms to steal his birthright. It is my professional recommendation that he be confined to a secure room, preferably in the upper floors of the mansion, to prevent further harm to himself or others. Jonathan's hands felt cold and numb. He moved to the next document, a similar report concerning his great-grandfather, Jeremiah, dated 1835. The words seemed to leap from the page, each one a hammer blow against the fragile walls of his sanity. The pattern of mental deterioration observed in the patient, Mr. Jeremiah Morfield, is remarkably, almost preternaturally, similar to that of his late father. The onset of symptoms occurred at approximately the same age, 35 years, and has progressed along a near-identical trajectory, deepening paranoia. Complex hallucinations centered on the mansion's architecture, and a propensity for sudden, unpredictable behavior. What is particularly intriguing from a clinical standpoint, and a challenge to our current understanding of hereditary afflictions, is the specific nature of his delusions. They echo those of his father in startling detail, including specific references to a whispering stone and a pact, despite historical accounts and family testimony confirming that Mr. Chettam Morfield has never had access to his father's private diaries or medical records. It is as if the delusion itself, rather than a mere predisposition to illness, is the inheritance. A chill, colder and more invasive than any autumn wind, settled deep in Jonathan's marrow. He was 35 years old. The pattern was not history, it was a prophecy, a meticulously documented death sentence. He pushed through the remaining papers with a sickening dread. His grandfather, Nathaniel, and his own father, William, had both succumbed, William Morfield, had hanged himself in the attic in 1865, just days after murdering 2 servants with a wood axe. Jonathan shoved the documents away, a wave of nausea causing the room to spin. This was a secret his mother had carried to her grave, the reason she had fled, desperate to outrun a past that was not merely written in history, but encoded in their very blood. A sudden noise from upstairs, a loud, definitive thud, followed by the sound of splintering wood, tore him from his horrified trance. It was the house. He thought with a surge of irrational fear. The house was guiding him. Cautiously, Jonathan climbed the stairs once more. At the far end of the corridor, the door to a long disused guest room was ajar. Inside, a heavy, gilt-frame portrait had fallen from the wall. He turned it over. It was his father, William. His painted eyes seemed to stare out with a silent, desperate warning. As Jonathan struggled to replace the heavy picture, his fingers brushed against a loose section of the wall behind it, a hidden latch. With a faint click, a panel of the wall swung inwards, revealing a low entrance into darkness. The air that wafted out was stale, starved of light and life for decades. It was a secret office, an airless, cramped space designed for concealment. On a simple desk lay more diaries. These belonged to his father. He sat in the dusty chair, feeling a sense of sacrilege as he opened the last volume, dated 1865, the year of his father's death. March 10th, his father had written, "The script initially firm. The voices are louder now. I can no longer dismiss them as fatigue. They call to me from the basement. It is a summons. I know what happened to my father when he finally gave in. I know what he found. Elizabeth says I should seek medical help. But the physicians are children playing with blocks in the face of this. This is not a common disease. It is the curse of the Moorfields." A few pages later, the entry was more desperate. April 2nd. I have found Elijah's original purchase documents. He acquired these lands from the Wampanoag for a pittance. They warned him. Their shaman drew maps of the spirit world for him, showing this hill as a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where ancient things, things without names, slept fitfully beneath the earth. Elijah, a man of the Enlightenment, saw only superstition. He built his mansion upon their sacred ground, and he dug his basement deep. It was there, in the cold, virgin earth, that he found it, the first stone. His journal describes it with awe, a black, unearthly object that seemed to consume the light, a piece of the night sky fallen to earth, the same stone that now calls to me. The final entries became a descent into madness, fragmented sentences and scrawled alien symbols. Jonathan's own sanity felt as if it were fraying at the edges just by reading them. The last entry, dated 3 days before his father's suicide, was a single, desolate sentence, written with a hand that must have been trembling uncontrollably. "I can no longer resist. The bond must be fed. I must go down." Jonathan closed the diary. The daylight was dying, and the shadows in the secret room seemed to writhe. He had to know. He retrieved his oil lamp, its flame a tiny, defiant flicker in the growing dark. The setting sun cast a final reddish glow through the grimy windows, tinting the decaying walls with a hue like old blood. He opened the door under the staircase. A draught of cold, ancient air rose to meet him, carrying the odor of wet earth, of tombs, and something else. A faint, sharp metallic tang, reminiscent of a slaughterhouse. With the lamp held high, he began his descent. This was no ordinary cellar. The stone steps were steep and uneven, worn smooth in the center by the passage of generations of doomed men. The air grew colder with each step, the silence deeper, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft drip, drip, drip of water from an unseen source. The stone walls were slick with an unnaturally vibrant green moss, cold and clammy to the touch. As he went deeper, he saw them the symbols from his father's diary, carved crudely into the stone. He paused, tracing one with his finger. It felt strangely warm, and a low, almost subaudible hum seemed to vibrate through the stone into his very bones. He reached the bottom. The basement was a labyrinth. He passed a chamber of rotting crates, their contents long since turned to dust. He passed another, an abandoned alchemical laboratory, its glass beakers and retorts coated in a thick shroud of filth. As if a mad experiment had been interrupted mid-process centuries ago. He felt unseen eyes upon him, the weight of a gaze that was ancient and utterly devoid of anything he could recognize as life. It was in the third and final chamber that he found it. In the precise center of the circular room stood a crude stone altar, dark and stained, and upon it rested an object that seemed to be a wound in the fabric of reality. It was a black stone, the size of a fist, with a porous, non-reflective surface that seemed to pulse with a slow, malevolent, internal rhythm, like a sleeping heart. It did not reflect the lamplight. It drank it. It consumed it, creating a pocket of intensified, absolute darkness around itself. Around the altar, a circle of the same alien symbols was carved into the earthen floor, the grooves filled with a substance so dark it could only be ancient, coagulated blood. A sudden, impossible gust of wind, born from the stagnant air of the sealed chamber, swept through the room. It slammed against his lamp with a focused, intelligent force, extinguishing the flame and plunging him into a darkness so complete, so suffocating, that it felt like a physical weight. His breath hitched in his throat. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a ringing, listening silence, thick with anticipation. And then he heard it. It was a whisper, so close and so clear it bypassed his ears and was born directly in the terrified center of his mind. It was a voice, ancient and vast, filled with a patient, possessive, and triumphant hunger. "Welcome back, Moorfield. We've been waiting for you." Bannock was a physical thing, a feral creature that clawed its way up Jonathan's throat, choking him. It was a blind, primal force that cared nothing for reason or courage. It propelled him backwards, his feet stumbling over the uneven earthen floor in the suffocating, absolute darkness. He scrambled, turning, his hands flailing before him, until they met the cold, damp stone of the corridor. He did not run. He fled, a desperate, clumsy climb up the stone steps, feeling the phantom touch of invisible hands grasping at his ankles with every upward step. When he finally burst through the doorway into the relative safety of the entrance hall, he did not hesitate. He slammed the heavy oak door to the basement shut. The sound a cannon shot in the dead silence of the mansion. His trembling fingers fumbled with the old iron key, turning it in the lock with a definitive, grating finality. Breathless, he leaned his entire weight against the door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The house was silent again, but its silence was different now. It was not empty. It was the predatory stillness of a beast that knows its prey is trapped. Through the grime of the window, he saw the first, faint, gray hints of dawn beginning to stain the eastern sky. It was a promise of a world that was still sane, a world to which he no longer belonged. He knew with chilling certainty that he could not spend another night within these walls. This house was a tomb, and it was patiently waiting to claim him, grabbing nothing but the coat on his back and the terrible knowledge in his mind. Jonathan Morfield unbolted the main door and ran, not looking back. fleeing into the cold, misty embrace of the pre-dawn gloom. The 40-minute walk to the town of Blackwood was a journey through a purgatorial landscape. A dense fog had rolled in, blanketing the Massachusetts countryside and muffling all sound, save for the crunch of his own footsteps on the gravel road. The towering pines of the surrounding forest were ghostly sentinels, their branches dripping with moisture, their forms indistinct in the thick, white air. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of unseen life in the undergrowth sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He could not shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed by the same ancient malevolent gaze that had pinned him in the basement. When the small wooden houses of Blackwood finally emerged from the fog, they seemed like an impossible haven of normalcy. It was a typical small New England settlement, with a white church steeple pointing a hopeful finger towards a sky that was still stubbornly gray. As Jonathan entered the main grocery store, the handful of early morning customers and the proprietor all stopped their conversations mid-sentence. All eyes turned to him. In their gazes, he saw not simple curiosity, but a flicker of something else, a deep-seated, almost fearful recognition. "Good morning," Jonathan said, his voice rough. "My name is Jonathan Moorfield. I've recently come to stay at the property on the outskirts of town." "A Moorfield," interrupted the man behind the counter. A corpulent gentleman with graying hair and a weary face. He wiped his hands on his apron, his expression guarded. "Harold Simmons. It's been a long time since we've seen a Moorfield in these parts." His eyes held a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Not since the incident with your father." Jonathan swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "That's what I'd like to know more about. I found certain documents in the mansion, but there is still much I don't understand." The silence that followed was heavy and laden with the tension of shared, unspoken history. Finally, Harold Simmons gestured with his head toward the back of the store. "Come with me," he said, his tone low. "This is not a conversation for public ears." In the small, cluttered office, surrounded by ledgers and shipping manifests, Harold began to speak. He was the town's unofficial historian, the keeper of its oral traditions and darkest memories. The Morfields have been a shadow over this town since 1790, he began, his voice a low rumble. Elijah Morfield was an ambitious man, a man from Boston with grand plans. He bought that land from the Wampanoag for a pittance, ignoring their warnings. What warnings Jonathan pressed, the words from his father's diary echoing in his mind. "They called that place the land of hungry spirits," Harold said, his eyes distant. "They said it was a portal, a weak spot where ancient entities, things that were old when the world was young, slept uneasily beneath the earth." Of course, Elijah was a modern, educated man. He didn't believe in superstitions. Harold sighed, a sound heavy with generational grief. It started with him, as it always starts with the Moorfields. First, the isolation. Then, the rumors of strange behavior, of experiments conducted in the mansion's newly dug basement. They say he found something down there, something that changed him, that invited something in. He opened a drawer and removed a yellowed, brittle newspaper clipping, carefully preserved in oilcloth. It was the account of what had happened to William Morfield in 1865. It described in cold, clinical detail how Jonathan's father had murdered 2 mansion employees with an axe before hanging himself. The authorities, it noted, had found strange symbols, painted with blood on the attic walls, and a diary filled with incoherent communications with entities from beyond the veil. As Jonathan stared at the faded print, his world tilting on its axis, a young woman entered the office. She was perhaps 30, with intelligent, sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses and brown hair tied in a severe, practical bun. "Father, Dr. Blackwood is here for his order." Her eyes fell on Jonathan, widening slightly in recognition. "Eleanor, this is Jonathan Morfield," Harold introduced. "Mr. Morfield, my daughter, Eleanor Simmons." Moorfield Eleanor examined him not with fear, but with an intense academic curiosity. From the Moorfield mansion she was, Harold explained, the town librarian, and was, by a chilling coincidence, writing a thesis on behavior patterns in isolated family lineages in New England. The Moorfield case was the centerpiece of her study. Later that afternoon, in the quiet, hallowed halls of the Blackwood Municipal Library, Eleanor laid out her research on a large oak table. It was a chillingly methodical, academic confirmation of everything Jonathan had feared. "The consistency of the symptoms and the age of onset are a statistical impossibility," she explained, her voice calm and precise as she pointed to a meticulously drafted timeline. "In typical cases of hereditary mental illnesses, there are variations. But with the Morfield men, it's as if we are observing the same disease, a single entity, manifesting in exactly the same way, at the same age, generation after generation. Furthermore," she continued, "the condition exclusively affects Morfield men who reside in the mansion for prolonged periods. Those who left Blackwood, like your great-uncle Thomas, who moved to California in 1840, lived completely normal lives." She then produced the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. It was a sepia photograph of the mansion, taken by a traveling photographer in 1860. "Observe the attic window," she urged. Jonathan took the photograph with a trembling hand. There, in the dark pane of the attic window, a pale, ghostly figure was clearly visible, observing the photographer. It was a face that bore a sickening, undeniable resemblance to his own. "Is this my grandfather?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Eleanor replied gravely. "Hotel and travel records confirm that on the day this photograph was taken, your grandfather was in Boston on business. The mansion should have been empty." The truth was no longer a question of sanity. It was a fact, supported by history, by science, and now by a photograph that had captured a ghost. The knowledge settled not as a relief, but as a verdict. He was not going mad. The reality was infinitely worse. He and Eleanor, the man of experience and the woman of research, made a pact. They had to go back. Returning to the mansion with Eleanor felt different. The fear was still present, a cold knot in his stomach. But it was no longer the paralyzing terror of the unknown. It was the grim resolve of a soldier marching into a battle he knew he might not survive. As a researcher, Eleanor had a professional, almost obsessive need to document the phenomenon. As a human being, she refused to let him face it alone. She insisted that, according to all records, the entity's focus was solely on the Moorfield men. She believed she would be safe, an observer. It was a tragically flawed assumption. They spent the evening in the library, the fireplace crackling, pushing back the oppressive cold. On the large table, they created a single, comprehensive timeline of the curse. laying out the medical records, Eleanor's research, the newspaper clippings, and the ancestral diaries. It was here, seeing the full, horrifying tapestry woven together, that the final pieces clicked into place. The blood rituals, Eleanor murmured, pointing to a passage in Jeremiah's diary. He repeatedly mentions a ritual that would strengthen his connection to what he calls the ancients. And my father mentions it too, Jonathan confirmed, his finger tracing a line in William's journal. He writes about offering blood to the stone to feed the bond. It seems they believed they were in communication with some kind of entity, Eleanor concluded, her academic detachment warring with the sheer horror of the words. And that the stone was the conduit, the doorway, and blood was the key. It was as if speaking the truth aloud had summoned it. A sudden, violent crash from upstairs made them both jump. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy, dragging footsteps, echoing across the ceiling. But this time, they were not hesitant or exploratory. They were purposeful. They were coming for them. They cautiously climbed the stairs, Jonathan now armed with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The sound was coming from the master bedroom. The door, which Jonathan was sure he had left open, was now firmly closed. As he reached for the handle, he found it was locked from the inside. Impossible, he whispered. From within the room, a voice began to speak. It was a deep, guttural, inhuman sound, speaking in a language that twisted the very air, a litany of syllables that felt ancient and wrong. It was the voice from the basement. As they stood frozen in terror, Eleanor pointed to the gap under the door. A dark, viscous substance was beginning to seep into the corridor. It was thick, almost black in the dim lamplight, and the sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood filled the air. "We need to get out of here," Jonathan said, pulling Eleanor by the arm. At that exact moment, the door was not opened, but shattered, blown violently inwards off its hinges. The room beyond was completely dark, but in that darkness, something moved. It was a tall, skeletal figure, its limbs too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. As it stepped into the faint light of the corridor, it revealed a face that was a distorted, cadaverous, and leering parody of Jonathan's own. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits, and its mouth stretched into an impossible, predatory smile. "Run!" Jonathan shouted, pushing Eleanor toward the stairs. They descended in a blind panic, hearing the creature's unnervingly rapid, scraping movements behind them. When they reached the entrance hall, Jonathan threw his weight against the main door, only to find it sealed shut. As solid as the stone walls around it, he ran to the nearest window. But it too was sealed, not nailed or locked, but as if the glass and wood had fused into a single, unbreakable piece. The house was alive, and it would not let them leave. The creature's claws scratched against the wood of the library door, which they had managed to slam and block with a heavy bookshelf. "Jonathan Moorfield?" the voice called, its tone now a perfectly comprehensible, layered chorus of multiple voices speaking in unison. "Your blood belongs to the ancients. The lineage must continue. The pact must be honored." "The pact?" Jonathan shouted back, his voice ragged with terror. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing we wanted from your father, and his father before him," the chorus replied, the sound seeming to come from all around them. A host, a portal, a sacrifice. The library door began to crack and splinter under an impossible, supernatural force. That's it, Eleanor whispered urgently, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with intellectual fire. The diaries, the reports, everything points to this. It's not a hereditary illness. It's a possession, a parasitic entity bound to your bloodline. This is madness, Jonathan protested, though he knew she was right. The stone in the basement, Eleanor continued, her voice quick and desperate as the bookshelf began to slide. It's the anchor, the connection point. If we want to end this, we have to face its origin. They had no choice. They ran through a side door to the dining room and into the kitchen, hearing the library door shatter behind them. In the pantry, Jonathan tore aside empty barrels, revealing a dusty trapdoor. As the creature's distorted shadow fell upon the kitchen walls, he wrenched it open and helped Eleanor down a steep ladder before following, pulling the door shut above them. They advanced through a low, claustrophobic service tunnel, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decay, until it opened into a chamber Jonathan recognized the improvised laboratory in the basement. Beyond it lay the altar chamber. They entered. The black stone rested on its altar, but now it seemed to pulse more visibly, emitting a dull, lightless glow that seemed to warp the very air around it. The creature had followed. They heard the trapdoor behind them being torn from its frame. Jonathan, the diaries, Eleanor said urgently. Did they mention any way to stop this? His mind raced, forcing itself to work through the terror. James, my great-granduncle. He survived. He wrote something about a purification ritual Sarah Pequot taught him. Something about blood freely given, not taken by force. We don't have the incantation, Eleanor said, her hope fading as the sound of claws on stone grew closer. But if the stone responds to Moorfield blood, and if intention is what matters. Jonathan understood. He looked at the pulsating stone, feeling its insidious, silent call in his mind. He took a small pocket knife from his coat, and after a single, deep breath, he made a deep, clean cut across the palm of his hand. Blood welled up, red and bright. He stepped towards the altar. I, Jonathan Moorfield, he declared, his voice firm and clear, ringing with the weight of generations of suffering. Offer my blood, not to strengthen this bond, but to sever it, not to honor the pact, but to break it. I release my lineage from this curse. He pressed his bleeding hand firmly against the cold, pulsing surface of the black stone. The moment his blood touched it, a searing, white-hot pain shot up his arm, as if he had grasped a live wire. The stone began to pulse violently, emitting a low hum that quickly intensified into a shrill, inhuman scream that vibrated through the very rock beneath their feet. The creature appeared at the entrance to the chamber, its form contorted in fury. It advanced, but stopped abruptly, a few feet from the altar, as if held back by an invisible, agonizing barrier. Fine cracks began to spread across the surface of the black stone, like spider webs of light in the darkness. The scream from the stone grew in intensity, and the creature began to convulse violently, its shadowy form flickering and dissolving, being pulled like smoke into the fracturing artifact. The pain in Jonathan's hand was unbearable, but he pressed harder, his entire will focused on single purpose. With a final, agonizing effort, he felt the stone crack completely under his fingers. A flash of impossible black light exploded from the altar, throwing both Jonathan and Eleanor against the far wall of the chamber. And then there was only silence. Jonathan slowly opened his eyes. He was alive. In place of the black stone, only inert, charcoal-like fragments remained. The curse was broken. He looked at his hand. The cut was deep, but what was more worrying was the inky black stain that was already spreading from the wound, like ink bleeding into paper just beneath his skin. The entity was gone, but it had left its mark. Silence, profound and absolute, descended upon the altar chamber. It was a quiet so deep it felt louder than the preceding chaos. The inhuman scream of the stone was gone. The violent energy dissipated, leaving only the sharp scent of ozone and shattered rock. Jonathan slowly, painfully, pushed himself to a sitting position, every muscle in his body aching from the concussive force. Eleanor was already kneeling beside him, her face smudged with dust, her eyes shining with a mixture of terror and triumphant relief. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jonathan, you did it." His gaze fell upon the altar, where the malevolent black stone had pulsed with a life antithetical to nature. There were now only inert charcoal-like fragments. They did not absorb the light. They did not thrum with a silent, hungry rhythm. They were just pieces of dead rock, their power extinguished. "Is it over?" Jonathan asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. "I believe so," Eleanor replied, her analytical mind already processing the events. "The creature, it disappeared the instant the stone broke. The anchor is destroyed." Jonathan looked down at his wounded hand. He had expected pain, but what he felt was a spreading, invasive coldness. The cut was deep, but it was the aftermath that horrified him. From the edges of the wound, an inky black stain was visibly spreading, not like a bruise, but like dark ink bleeding into the paper-thin layers of his skin, forming intricate, vein-like patterns. The entity was gone, but it had left its mark of final, parasitic claim. Eleanor tore a strip of fabric from a petticoat, her practical nature taking over. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice tight with concern as she improvised a bandage. "As soon as dawn breaks." They made their way out of the basement. The mansion seemed different now. It was still old and decaying, but the oppressive, sentient weight that had permeated its atmosphere was gone. It felt hollow, like the massive corpse of some great beast, its malevolent spirit having finally departed. As Eleanor helped him into an armchair in the derelict living room, Jonathan looked at his bandaged hand, where the black stain continued its slow, inexorable creep up his wrist. At what cost had this victory come? "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, her gaze fixed on his hand, her mind connecting the final dots of her research. "We will seek out Ruth Pequot. Your great-granduncle James survived this. If anyone can help with what's happening to you now, it's her." The journey to the Wampanoag Reservation the next day was an arduous pilgrimage. Jonathan's condition had deteriorated. The black stain had extended past his wrist, creeping with a chilling slowness towards his elbow, leaving the skin cold and numb. Each step was a struggle against a profound, unnatural weakness. And by the time they reached the small wooden cabin nestled among ancient pines, he was leaning heavily on Eleanor, pale with pain and exhaustion. Ruth Pequa was waiting for them on the porch, as if she had been expecting them for a lifetime. She was an elderly woman, her copper skin a roadmap of deep wrinkles, her dark eyes sharp and penetrating, holding a wisdom as ancient as the trees surrounding her cabin. "I have been expecting you, grandson of William Moorfield," she said, her voice calm yet resonant with power. "The spirits of this land spoke of your coming. They spoke of the breaking of the stone." Her eyes immediately fixed on his bandaged arm. A flicker of something ancient and grave passed through her expression. "The mark of the ancients," she murmured. "Come inside. We have little time." The interior of the cabin was warm and fragrant with drying herbs. Ruth helped Jonathan to a low bench and gently unwrapped the bandage. She examined the black stain, which now pulsed with a faint, sickly light beneath his skin. "You broke the stone," she said, looking into his eyes. "Few have ever had the courage. But in doing so, you created a new pathway, a personal one. The ancients are attempting to use your body as their new doorway." "Can you help him?" Eleanor asked. Ruth nodded slowly. "My great-grandmother, Sarah, developed a ritual for such cases. She helped your relative, James, when he came to her with the same mark. As she gathered herbs, powders, and vials, she explained the lore passed down through her people. The ancients are parasites from a reality that runs parallel to ours. They feed on consciousness. They do not create. They only consume. Your ancestors' pact offered them a gateway through his lineage." She turned to Jonathan, her expression grave. "The ritual to save you has 3 parts: purification, severing, and protection. But there is a price, a terrible one. The ancients are bound to your bloodline. To break this connection permanently, to ensure they can never again use a Moorfield as a key, the bloodline itself must end." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the crackling fire. Jonathan thought of the ghosts of his ancestors, and then, for a fleeting, painful moment, of the ghosts of children he would never have. He looked at his arm, at the dark stain writhing beneath his skin. He had begun this journey as a man with nothing. Now, he was being asked to sacrifice a future he never knew he might want. But he met Ruth's gaze, and in her ancient, knowing eyes, he found a strange peace. His end could have meaning. It could be a cleansing, a final, defiant victory. "I accept the price," he said, his voice firm. Ruth nodded. James made the same choice. She began the ritual. She made a precise cut at Jonathan's wrist, allowing his blood, streaked with black, to drip into a ceremonial bowl. "Drink," she commanded. The liquid tasted of ashes and ancient earth. As he swallowed, it burned its way through his body. "Now comes the most difficult part," Ruth warned, beginning to beat a hypnotic, primal rhythm on a small drum. "They will not give up their new home easily. They will fight." She began to chant in a language older than any he had ever heard. The fire in the hearth erupted, its flames changing color, red to blue, to green, to an impossible, light-emitting black. The pain in Jonathan's arm became a singular, all-consuming agony. The voices began, clearer than ever, speaking directly into his mind. "You are ours, Jonathan Morfield. Your blood is our pathway. You cannot deny us." Horrific, Non-Euclidean images flooded his consciousness. He fought, clinging to the reality of the cabin, to Eleanor's worried face, to the grounding rhythm of Ruth's chanting. He felt something fundamental being torn from him, an invisible, parasitic thread. The pain was indescribable, but with it came a sensation of clarity, of liberation. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The fire died to smoldering ashes. The silence was absolute. Jonathan looked at his hand. The black stain had receded, concentrating itself at the site of the original cut, forming a dark, permanent scar in the shape of an irregular, many-pointed star. "It is done," Ruth said, her voice filled with exhaustion. "The bond is broken. The mark will remain as a reminder and a protection." In the weeks that followed, Jonathan, with Eleanor's help, sold the Moorfield property to a lumber company that planned to clear the land, a final erasure of the cursed ground, before leaving Blackwood forever. They returned to the mansion one last time, in the grand, cold fireplace of the library. They burned every page of the diaries, every medical report, every scrap of paper that documented the family's long nightmare. With each page, he fed to the fire. Jonathan felt another thread of the curse turn to ash. The dangerous knowledge would die with him. He visited the town cemetery, standing before the weathered gravestones of Elijah, Jeremiah, Nathaniel, and William. They were men consumed by forces they could not understand. With him, their lineage of pain would end. With him, they would finally find peace. Eleanor accompanied him to the train station on the day of his departure. Their farewell was bittersweet, laden with the weight of a shared trauma no one else could ever comprehend. "Perhaps you might visit Boston someday," he offered, a tentative promise of a new, unwritten chapter. "I'd like that," she replied, with a small, hopeful smile. As the train pulled away, carrying him towards an unknown future, Jonathan watched the landscape of his ancestral home recede. He touched the star-shaped scar on his hand, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid for freedom. It was a heavy burden, the knowledge that he was the last of his line. But as the train carried him towards a future unburdened by ancient curses and hungry entities, Jonathan Morfield felt something he had not truly experienced since this ordeal began. He felt hope. The Morfield lineage would end with him, but it would end in victory, not defeat. The insanity that had run through their veins for generations had finally been purged by a conscious, willed sacrifice. Some endings, he now understood, were also beginnings, and some truths, learned at a terrible cost, were the only things that could ever truly set a man free.